Hey scholars, this is a lecture video for chapters 10 and 13. So 10 is on introductions and conclusions, 13 is on informative speaking. So chapter 10 is somewhat self-explanatory as you're reading through it. You're reading about introductions. It's how you begin a speech. And it's one of the most important parts of the speech. It's how you set the tone. So be sure that you're looking at the PowerPoint presentation that goes along with this lecture video. You'll see that in the same module on our course page um, for chapters 10 and 13. So on that first lecture slide, I'm sorry, the first PowerPoint slide, slide 2, with notes on it. This PowerPoint has there's a variety of slides where I have my own notes in there. So Phil, I encourage you to look at those notes or read those notes. Those are my notes that I've used in the past for when I do this in a classroom. And of course, you can add to the notes. As a reminder, the whole logic for the way that you should be doing this is you should have already, by the time you listen to this video, you should have already read chapters 10 and 13 thoroughly in detail, taking notes in your textbook, underlining, highlighting, all that kind of stuff. And then you look at the PowerPoint and watch the video, and then it'll enhance your understanding. As I mentioned, I don't cover everything in the PowerPoints. I'm um, highlighting a variety of things, specifically the things that I'm looking for when I'm grading your speeches and assignments. So the all of it's important, but the stuff I highlight in the videos are the ones that you really want to focus on. But you're obviously responsible for all the reading. So introduction sets a tone for the speech. The purpose is to gain the audience's attention, establish your credibility, motivate your audience, and then provide a preview. So first thing you do, the first words that come out of your mouth when you're looking at an audience, if you're giving a speech or a presentation of some sort, a TED talk, you're pitching an idea, you're giving a sales pitch to a group of investors, or you're at a job interview and you're given an opportunity to speak, and you have to demonstrate your knowledge on a topic, right? Whatever the situation is, at some point outside of this class, outside of your time in this public speaking course, you'll have another sort of public presentation. It might not take the form of a traditional formal public speech, but the bottom line is an introduction is crucial. It sets the tone for the speech. So get the attention, establish credibility, give your audience a reason to listen, and then provide a preview. Tell the audience what they can expect to hear. And I mentioned that the credibility statement, there's slide 3, credibility, that's optional. What I mean by optional is whatever topic you're discussing for our class, for the speeches that you're giving in our class, you might not have expertise on a topic, and that's okay. You don't have to. I mean, that's kind of the nature of this class. You're researching a topic and you're finding information about a topic, but that doesn't make you an expert. But if you do have expertise in a topic, if your topic happens to be something that you have a lot of familiarity with, like 10, 15 plus years familiarity with a certain topic, mention that to the audience, right? Whether it's for our class or outside of this class, if you know something really, really well, briefly mention your connection to that topic. It gives you credibility. So with the attention getter, that's slide number 4. Like I said, the first words out of your mouth should be an attention getter. Don't begin the speech by saying, "Hey, how's it going? Hi, I'm Johnny. So my speech is on." Like the first words that come out of your mouth should be your attention getter. All right, everyone's looking at you, focuses on you. You're on stage, and we're all looking at you. So we're expecting to hear something interesting. And if you just say, "My speech is going to be on chili peppers," some people in your audience are going to be like, "Well, yeah, I know. It says it right here in the pamphlet." Like, of course I know that. Don't. It's kind of like, tell me something I don't know. No, not to. I'm not implying that everyone in the audience is snarky or cynical or anything like that, but it's sort of like embedded within us. I already know what your speech is going to be on, right? I see it on the list of speakers or the agenda for the day or whatever's going on for the conference presentation, whatever your context is. So my brain has sort of been trained to like expect to hear something interesting, something to capture my attention. So you want to really like spend time to develop an attention getter that's really going to captivate your audience's attention. And if you do it right, it's only something that I say it's at 10 to 15 seconds to deliver. Depends on the length of your speech. If you have an 8-minute speech versus a 4-minute speech, you'll probably have a longer attention getter. But relatively short, in comparison to the rest of the entire speech, to the rest of the introduction. In your first major speech, I believe it's a 4 to 6 or 5 to 7 minute speech. I forget off the top of my head. Let's just call it a 5-minute speech. Well, if you have a 5-minute speech, the introduction is roughly should be about a minute. So the whole intro should be about a minute. That means your attention getter should be about 10 to 15 seconds. And if it's done well, you can get a lot said and a lot accomplished in that short amount of time. So that's why I really emphasize the importance of having a well thought out attention getter. There's several different types. Our textbook provides several examples of attention getters. Slide 5 on our PowerPoint here. You can have a startling, shocking statement. I put that one in there. Did you know that nearly half of all college students in the U.S. will not end up graduating with a degree? Maybe you're thinking, I had no idea. I say that because that's an area of research that I focused on for my dissertation. And so anytime I brought that question up to someone, or if I mention it in a classroom, I'll tell my students, hey, were y'all aware of the fact that approximately almost half of all college students historically for the last 100 years or so, about half of all students do not end up graduating with a college degree. So one way to get the audience's attention, especially when they're college students. You can start with a quotation, ask rhetorical questions. Quotations can be powerful. I have that one from Mark Twain: under certain circumstances, urgent circumstances, desperate circumstances, profanity provides a relief even denied to prayer. And that's actually a quotation that I used to start my paper. I wrote some papers on profanity when I was in grad school, did some profanity research projects, very interesting topic. So whether it's a speech or a paper, within a paper, you should still have an attention getter in a paper. I mean, you're not writing papers, term papers, or essays or anything like that for this class, but an attention getter, an introduction is one of the most important things of any sort of a communication message, right? First impressions. Questions, you can ask rhetorical questions, which is one of those things where you ask the question and then you want to pause, right? You don't want to, if you had a series of 3 or 4 questions, you want to ask the question, give it like a good 2-second pause, which is about that long, and then ask the second question, give it 2-second pause. It's only about that long, right? When you're speaking, a 2-second pause as a speaker can feel like a really long time. Whether it's 2 seconds or 1.5 or 1 3/4, you don't want to just ask a question and then immediately go into the next question. You ask a question, give an audience an opportunity to respond internally. We're not going to respond externally. We're not going to answer your question in a classroom or whether it's on the internet or on a camera. But yeah, asking questions, like really, really well thought out questions where you clearly explain them or clearly ask them, as a way to get the audience's attention. Humor, if you want to use humor, be mindful, be careful with that. If you're not good at telling jokes, then don't tell a joke. But if you are one of those people who generally is, if let's just say, at the sake of for you trying to remain humble, if a lot of your friends would describe you as someone who's really funny and is really good at telling jokes, hey, maybe think of that for an attention getter. As long as it's appropriate and as long as you execute it properly, then yeah, consider humor. Most students don't. Sometimes they do, and sometimes it's great. Sometimes they use humor, and I'm like, I don't think anybody knew that you were trying to be funny. But one to consider. And then statistics. Statistics is a form of a startling, shocking statement. The example I mentioned earlier, that's also a statistic, but yeah, they're very similar. So that's a variety of ways to get the audience's attention. And then you'll want to, sorry, The other part of the introduction is, as I mentioned before, you're giving your audience a reason to listen. So how is this relevant for them? How can you make your topic relatable to them? I don't have a specific slide on what I'm talking about right now. Uh, I'm elaborating from an earlier slide. So why, like, how is this relevant and relatable to your audience? And then mention your credibility. You could talk about how you why you chose that particular topic. If you don't have expertise in that topic, why'd you choose it? Share a little bit about yourself. And all of this is taking place in a really short amount of time, but it's very condensed, and you will have already outlined it. You will have already practiced it several times, making it more and more concise, and you have like a very nice condensed tight package of an introduction, which then sets the tone for the rest of the speech. And then, of course, you have the speech, your main points with your supporting points, with transitions, etc. So that's the introduction. A lot of people, in terms of an attention getter, they start with a story, um, and I'll talk more about that in the rest of this towards the end of the PowerPoint. But a lot of people begin with a story, or they begin with some ideas in the introduction, and then they have the body, the main points, supporting points, and then in the conclusion, sometimes a speaker will refer back. They refer back to something they mentioned in the introduction, like a story about Jennifer in the introduction, and it's a story where the speaker provides a very vivid description of who Jennifer is and what happened to her, and then the speaker ends that by saying, and then she went away to college in Europe, right? And then he gives a speech. And at the end, in the conclusion, the speaker might say, hey, I want you to remember the story of Jennifer I told at the beginning of my speech. I left off by saying that she went to college in Europe. Well, here's what happened for the rest of her life, right? And then you're kind of like, it's coming full circle. You begin with a story, you have the main points, and then you refer back to that story. You provide closure. Not a very large percentage of students do that, but it's common. It's common. I see it a lot. It's a really useful way to begin and end a speech, but it's certainly not doesn't ensure that you're going to get a good grade or anything. It's a really good strategy. So the conclusion is in some ways it's just as important as the introduction. It's letting the audience know that you're ending your speech. It's signaling to the audience that you're finishing to the speech. And it should be obvious. It should be obvious within your speech, based on your tone of voice, based on the things that you're saying. It should be very obvious that you're finishing your speech. Every once in a while, a student will give a speech, and it's almost like they're in mid-sentence. They're in the middle of a sentence, or they finish one thought, and then they just stop talking, and then they sit down, or they stop talking and the camera goes off. And I'm thinking, wait, what? Like, you were just right in the middle of a thought, or you just finished like one main point. Where's the conclusion? If the conclusion is worth, let's say, I don't have the rubric out in front of me, but let's say the conclusion is worth 20 points of the whole speech grade, of the entire speech grade. Let's just say the conclusion is worth 20 points. Well, if you don't have a conclusion, if you provide zero conclusion, guess how many points that means? You get 0 points. So you have to have some kind of conclusion. I mean, I guess you don't have to. If you don't have it, you get 0, right? So if you want those points, if you want to get the best grade possible, follow this approach. But the whole logic of it is you're letting the audience know that you're finishing. You do that by the things that you're saying. You'll see several examples in the textbook. I provide samples of conclusions and outlines and full speech manuscripts. I have those available. I will have those available at some point on our course page. I think they actually are available. I don't know. I'll have to double check. But anyhow, but what you're actually doing is you're synthesizing the main points. You're not just restating them, but you're synthesizing. Just like when you read a summary. When you're reading a summary or the conclusion of a chapter, it's not just restating everything. It's at least it shouldn't be. It's synthesizing and summarizing all the central components of what you just read, whether it was a 5-page chapter or a 50-page chapter, whether it's a 5-minute speech or a 10-minute speech. The conclusion is synthesizing. is you're the speaker. You're reinforcing the most important parts of the speech, the takeaways. What's a takeaway? What do you want your audience to take away from your speech? They're not going to remember. They're not going to remember everything. Your audience will remember everything, no matter how good of a speaker you are. They're not going to remember it all. But what are like the key things you want them to focus on? Well, that's if you have like 3 or 4 key things you want to focus on, mention those in the introduction, elaborate on those in the body, and then reinforce those in the conclusion. So that's what it's doing. It's a way to provide a memorable ending to your speech. It's a summary statement. You provide final thoughts, closure, like epiphanies, things that you learned from the speech. What are the final things that you want your audience to know? If in terms of a breakdown of how this looks, look on slide 12, right? I give you some sort of a formula, right? If there's five parts to a speech: introduction, main point 1, main point 2, main point 3, conclusion. The introduction should be about or each point, each of those 5 sections should be roughly 10 to 20% of the entire speech, roughly. Let's say 30 to 60 seconds per section, right? Roughly 30 to 60 seconds for the intro, 30 to 60 seconds, about a 1 minute per main point, and then another roughly 30 seconds per conclusion. There's not an exact formula, but if your introduction was 2.5 minutes, and main point 1 was 10 seconds, and main point 2 was 30 seconds, and main point 3 was a minute, and then the conclusion was 3 seconds. I mean, that's a very imbalanced distribution of time for all the central components. There should be an equal distribution of time, somewhat equal. It doesn't have to be exact, but it should be somewhat equal, about a minute per main point. The introduction should be around a minute. The conclusion usually is not as long as the introduction, but in that 30 to 45 second range, right, for a 5-minute speech. Sometimes what I see is the students are finished and then they have a conclusion, which literally is about 3 seconds long. Like I'll time it and I'm like, it's one very short sentence lasting 3 to 5 seconds. So hey, you did something, right? But if it's worth 20 points, then it should be 30 to 45 seconds, and yours is only like a couple seconds, barely saying anything, then you're not going to get a very high score. So part of it's a grading issue. Part of it is just following directions. Part of it is, hey, that's what we need, right? We need the end game. So the intro and conclusion, the reason I put a lot of emphasis on this, they're the beginning and the end. It's they're the parts that the audience will remember the most. Primacy effect is the idea that in a sequence of communication, in a communication sequence, in a communication exchange, whether it's a conversation or a speech or whatever, the primacy effect suggests that we tend to remember most. I just got a call on my phone. It's weird. I went in here. So we tend to remember most. The thing that we remember the most is what's said in the beginning of a conversation, and then the recency effect suggests that we remember the most what's said at the end of a conversation. So it can kind of go both ways. Generally speaking, humans will do a better job remembering the first thing you say and the last thing you say, like the beginning and the ending. Not that the middle is unimportant, but it's just like it's the first impression and the lasting impression. So that's why you really want to construct those and plan those very, very well. So one thing I have on there on slide 12, I say perhaps wait until after you've completed the main points. Meaning, sometimes students say, I can't think of an introduction. I can't think of an attention getter for my speech. And then I ask, like, have you done all your research? Have you gotten the outline done? They're like, no. Try that first. I mean, sometimes we naturally want to go from beginning to end. Like we want to build something linearly where we want to do the introduction first because that's the beginning and then work our way through. Doesn't always work out that way. In my opinion, it's best to construct the main points first. Not a lot of professors will say it differently, but I think work on the main points first. And then as you're working on your speech, as you're as you're doing research, you're reading through articles, you're reading through your books, you're developing the main points, the supporting points, you're making sense out of everything. At some point, you'll probably get some ideas for how to begin it, for how to begin your speech, what you want to put in the introduction. It's hard to create a preview statement for something that you haven't yet created. So whether it's a speech or a 5-page research paper or a 25-page research paper, I always leave the introduction last. So I'll just have a skeleton outline or a skeleton format within a paper, and I'll type out the words introduction. And then in parentheses, I'll put type me, like TYPEME, and I'll highlight that yellow and skip it. I don't even think about the introduction. I don't know how to introduce this. I haven't written it yet. That's my experience, and in all the years of college that I had, and of all the writing I've done. That is what has worked best for me. So, just nevertheless, the introduction and conclusion are super important. Slide 13, I have a link to a communication coach. This is a YouTube page which I provide on our course page. I believe it's under useful resources, useful documents. He's a professor communication coach, Alex Lyon. If you click on that link, you'll see him in a 4-minute video. He explains the 4 things that every introduction must have, and I'm pretty much in alignment with him. The one thing I disagree with him about, and hey, it's good to disagree. He says that with the preview statement, it should be like super short and brief, and I would disagree. It's almost like he's saying, hey, if a 3-second preview statement is sufficient, 30 seconds is too long, and I'm saying 3 seconds is probably too short, 30 seconds is too long, so maybe like 10 seconds. I mean, it almost sounds like, it can kind of feel like you're splitting hairs, when you're trying to distinguish how much time to allot to each different part of the speech. But the end product, the end result, is a 5-minute speech. So you want to be strategic and crafty and choosy with how you use your time. If you're a recording artist, if you're a performance artist, and your end product is a 5-minute video, a 5-minute song, a 5-minute production, you put a lot of work into how you want to allocate the process of allocating time to different components of what you're working on. Anyhow, all that to say, the preview statement should be detailed enough to where the audience is like, okay, now I know what your main points are going to be about. I know what the speech is going to be about, and I know what the main points are going to cover. You don't have to go into extreme depth with the preview statement. The preview statement is the pause. I call it an introduction sandwich, right? The very first part of the introduction, attention getter. The very last part of the introduction, preview statement. And in between is you can kind of play with exactly how you want to do that. But in between is tell the audience why should they listen? Give the audience motivation to listen, a reason to listen. What's your connection to this? Your experience with this? Your credibility to this? The overall significance of the topic, et cetera, right? There's a variety of things you can do in the middle, but first thing is attention getter, last thing, preview statement. Okay, on to chapter 13 on informative speaking. That first slide that there's information on, slide 15. So the whole purpose of a message to inform is to inform, right? The whole purpose of informative speaking is to inform or share information with other people to enhance their understanding of that information. The way you do that well is to build on common knowledge, to be novel. Whatever your topic is, chances are the audience might have some level of familiarity with it. Or I've seen lots of topics. I mean, I've seen, I've viewed thousands of speeches. So there's definitely a lot of speeches that I've seen and graded where, like, man, I've never heard of that before. I love that. I love getting a speech where I'm like, I've never heard of that topic, or I've never heard of that person, or whatever the case may be. But it's not like you have to choose something that no one's ever heard of before. If you choose a topic that's somewhat familiar to the audience, well, figure out how to build on that. How do you add to that? How do you add interesting, useful, novel information to what we already know? Tell me something I don't know, right? So you take the role of teacher by defining things, illustrating things, clarifying things, elaborating, etc. You're teaching us. You're not trying to persuade us yet. You're not trying to persuade us yet. We will have informative persuasive speeches, but for now, it's extremely important to remain impartial and nonpartisan. You see slide 16. Your purpose is not to persuade the audience or try to change their attitudes, beliefs, or values. You should be nonpartisan. If I'm talking about if I were to be talking about politics, you should have no idea if I'm for or pro, if I'm this side or that side, right? If I'm being nonpartisan, you shouldn't have any idea where I actually feel. And that can be challenging to do because it's not so much it is what I say, but it's also how I say it. So if I'm talking about an issue, but if my body language is saying that I'm very much for or against something, well, now I'm not being nonpartisan. Now I'm not being neutral. And some might say, well, it's impossible to be neutral when talking about politics. It's like, well, I guess. But you can certainly do a really good job of being a sort of a neutral force. That's kind of how I am. Like with a lot of things, I try to be. I try to be as neutral as possible. What is that called? The Switzerland approach or something like that. I try to be as neutral as possible um, because it's easier to talk about things when it comes to heated topics. Anyhow, we'll table that discussion for now and go back to what I'm talking about. For the informative speech, you won't do that at all. It's much more challenging to try to try to change someone's mind about something. It's so much more difficult to do that than it is to just teach. So for this first major speech, your goal is teaching, informing, enlightening. Um, 17, slide 17, enlighten. I'm enlightening you. I'm sharing information with you. I'm not advocating anything. I shouldn't be persuading you to think or do anything, right? And that's kind of the challenge. I emphasize that so much because sometimes it's an issue with student speeches for informative speeches. Most students' informative speeches are pretty much along those lines in terms of they're assuming the role of teaching and clarifying, etc. But when you'll send me ideas for your speech topics, if I look at your speech topics and I'm like, that's that's a persuasive topic. That's extremely persuasive. One, it shows to me that you're not following directions, or you don't understand it, or you didn't read the assignment and you really don't have any idea what you're doing, right? I don't know what category that might fall into, but if I see that to be the case, then I'll be sure to let you know that hey, you can't talk about that, or you want to change that, modify that. Worst case scenario, you say like, you know what, I'm just going to give the speech the way I want to give it, and then you give a speech, and it's supposed to be informative, and if the whole speech is persuasive in tone and nature and all that kind of stuff, it will likely yield a very low scoring grade. Anyhow, know your audience, present new information, interesting information. Um, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. There's lots of ways that you can inform. There's all different types of categories of informative speeches on to slide 19. So people, persons, groups of people, places, objects, events, concepts, issues. So what you'll be doing, I'll give you an option. So everyone in our class will choose from, you'll choose one type of informative speech topic. You'll either talk about, you're either going to give a speech on a person or an object or an event. One of those three: person, object, event. Our informative speeches are still, I think, several weeks away. Person can be any famous person, important person, person who served some sort of like who played a role in some sort of like cultural historical significance, etc. If you choose to give a speech on a person, what uh, what I highly recommend that you do is to choose a person that's sort of just neutral in terms of this person doesn't have a reputation of controversy, right? Consider your audience. Know who your audience is. You don't want to give an informative speech and enlighten an audience about a person where maybe half the audience is going to turn against you, or half the audience is going to get frustrated that you're talking about this person in a certain way. It's not really an issue for me, and I obviously I will approve topics. I'll have you send me speech topic examples before I approve them, and I'll approve one and tell you which one to go with. But really, like if you're going to give a speech on a person, focus on someone who you think, who you truly believe, who you and let's say the common majority, the common public would identify as a person who is well received by the public. There's books written about this person. They did good, right? Uh, I highly recommend that you follow that pattern. Um, but also even more importantly, try to find a person who has been written about. Who's there's research on this person. There's books and articles and documents. So yeah, that's what you would do if you were giving a speech on a person. Their major achievements, their major accomplishments, a historical perspective on this person, their life, and so on and so forth. If you choose it on an object can be anything that's like physical or tangible, right? It could be any like anything from the food to machines to electronics to computers to anything that's like physical, tangible. It could be an actual um, place. An object can actually be a place, like a famous museum. That would be an example of an object. It's also a place. So some choices for objects might kind of fall into the category of place, but we're not talking about just like cities or whatever countries when it comes to places. But anyways, objects can be anything physical, tangible. I've had students who are car enthusiasts, and then I had I had one student a few years ago. He gave an entire speech on a turbocharger. For those of you who know about cars, he actually had the turbocharger. He had it with him, and he was explaining how the turbocharger works. It was really interesting, and the whole speech was on that, right? With lots of research, with all kinds of relevant, credible resources to support his ideas. And then an event. An event can be an ongoing event, like um, the Olympics or some sort of like cultural event, a traditional event, something that happened at one place in time. I mean, at one point in time in history where it happened 50 years ago, 100 years ago, like something that happened on one day or several days or something like that, or an ongoing event. Nevertheless, something that you can do research on and find information about. And that's it. That's it for your choices for informative speaking. Okay, organizational patterns on to slide 21. There's chronological, pretty straightforward. If you're giving a speech, your main points will follow a time sequence. If you're talking about how the Great Wall of China was built, if you're talking about how something was built, well, in the first phase, this happened. The second phase, this happened. The third phase, this happened. If I'm talking about how to bake a cake, how to cook something, it would probably be a chronological pattern. First, buy the ingredients. Second, bring them home. Blah 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 blah. At some point, turn the oven on, right? Because when it comes to baking or cooking, the sequence, the time sequence for how you do things, it matters. For things like uh, other topics like fireworks, it doesn't matter. If you were to give a speech on the three most common fireworks used in, I don't know, Louisiana on Mardi Gras or something like that, you might have you'd have a topical organization. Main point one, you could swap main point one with main point three, and it wouldn't really make any difference. In other words, the time sequence really has no effect on how a speech makes sense if the speech is on fireworks. I mentioned Louisiana because in Louisiana there's lots of fireworks. I think they have fireworks for just about every event in the year. It's like St. Patrick's Day and 4th of July and New Year's Eve, and I mean if there's a holiday, it's like hey let's sell fireworks to go with the holiday. So there's lots of fireworks in lots of parts of Louisiana. It's fun. And then spatial is if you're giving a speech on a tour of Disneyland or something like that. most of you will either have chronological or topical for your informative speeches. Okay, so these next few slides 24 and on, I just have sample speeches. So these are speeches on different types of topics. So informative speech about a person. You got your specific purpose statement and then main point 1, 2, 3, 4. Chronological pattern, the first 20 years of his life, and then after the war, this is what he did, right? So chronological pattern, 4 main points there. A speech about an object informed the audience of the major alternative fuel cars now being developed. This is a bit dated, so I know that now it's, a big one is electricity, but um, fascinating topic in my opinion. But there are cars that can be powered by methanol, ethanol, hydrogen, natural gas. It's really cool. That's beside the point. The point is this is topical. It's not chronological. Um, I could have my first main point could be hydrogen, and my second main point could be electricity, and my third main point could be methanol. It doesn't really matter because it's just like it's a topical pattern. I just talk about one thing and I talk about another thing. The time sequence doesn't have any bearing on it. So that's most students usually, they understand that fairly well. A speech about an event. The 4 main events in women's gymnastics, right? So the speech is on, let's say, the Olympics, but if you were going to give a speech on something like the Olympics, I would highly, highly recommend that you get as narrow and focused as possible because the Olympics is like, there's so many different events within that event, right? The Olympics is like major event, and then within the Olympics they have, other types of events, gymnastics and all those different things, and then within those there's different things. So there's like Olympics, and then you have like subtopics and subtopics and subtopics. So the larger, broader category that you have, the more of an emphasis that you want to take on narrowing and really focusing and zeroing in on your topic. And then speech about a concept. Just to give you a different example of a speech, nonviolent resistance. So that's not an option. Speeches on concepts are not an option. So for an informative speech, it's person, object, or event. But sometimes you have an idea for a topic and you're not exactly sure, and you submit it to me, and then I'll let you know. I'll give you feedback. Okay, slide 28. The authors provide all these informative strategies: defining, reporting, describing, explaining, demonstrating, storytelling, comparing. Here's the thing to remember. Some people think like, man, how do I get up and talk for 5 minutes? How do I give a speech for 5 minutes? I've never done that before. Humans have historically been storytellers, right? It's like in our blood, in our DNA, from the time that we began to exist till present day. We have been storytellers. Humans have been predominantly an oral culture. The way that we get things, the way that we get our message across, the way that I communicate to people in front of me and to people further away from me is person to person, game of telephone, right? It wasn't until the Gutenberg Press was developed sometime, I don't remember, around 1500, 1400 time period. And once that happened, we moved from an oral culture to more of a print-based culture, right? Now we could get books and get them easily, and they were just being distributed and disseminated really, really quickly. And so we kind of removed a little bit of we removed ourselves a bit away from an oral culture, and now we're at a whole other level with technology and social media and all that kind of stuff. But just know, like, it's instinctual, like telling stories and defining things and describing things and comparing things. That's how things work. So they give you all these different strategies, and there's not one correct strategy. There's several ways to get your message across. The goal is pick which one works best for you, or you'll have a variety of goals, or you'll have a variety of strategies. As long as you're able to ensure that your audience has those takeaways from your speech, that's kind of like the whole point. At the end of my speech, whether I had a combination of reporting, explaining, and storytelling, regardless of which strategy I used, at the end of the speech, did you learn something? Were you can you share that information? If I gave you a speech, would you be able to go tell your friends like, oh, I heard the speech on the topic of chili peppers, and here's what I learned, and it might be like a couple things. Cool, awesome. That's like the idea. Another food analogy. There's several ways to make an omelet. The goal is to utilize the one that works best for you, your taste buds. So it's like when it comes to food, there's so many ways that you can make an omelet. There's so many ways you can make anything, right? The goal is you're having a variety of different, let's say, vegetables and different types of proteins and whatnot. There's so many different methods and combinations of things, but the bottom line, You, the customer, you, the one eating this omelet. Does it taste good? Can you take a bite? Can you describe it? Can you enjoy it? And if yeah, then if you say yes, then it's like cool. And it doesn't really matter what strategy I use. It doesn't matter which combination of ingredients I use. As long as it tastes good, that's all that really matters. So it's my food thing for the day. Some guidelines I have here, slide 30. Don't overestimate what the audience knows. Don't assume that we know your topic. Assume that you are the expert on the topic. You should be the expert on the topic. Make sure you relate the subject directly to the audience. How, like in a seemingly unrelatable topic, how do you make it relatable? You need to create that bridge. Don't be too technical, right? If you need to use technical terms, use technical terms, but make sure you explain them, just like we talked about in the other lecture videos on language. Be as descriptive as you can, be vivid, use word pictures, right? Try to appeal to the five senses. Personalize your ideas where you can. So if you want to talk about yourself in your speech, if certain elements of your speech are related to you personally, you might mention that. I mean, the speech is not it's not about you, but if you can personalize it, make a side reference to how you are somehow related to your speech topic, mention that. And be creative, try to have fun. Yeah, those are just some guidelines. The authors mentioned to adopt an encouraging retention mindset. Page 291 talks about that. How do I encourage retention? You do it strategically. So I have this I don't know what you would call this, an expression or something to help you remember, like a communication tool to help you remember one way to encourage retention. Tell us what you're going to tell us, and then tell us, and then tell us what you told us. It's kind of mouthy, right? So it's a weird thing to say. Tell us what you're going to tell us, and then tell us, and then tell us what you told us. It sounds weird, almost like kind of like frustrating to hear someone say that. But the whole point is give us a preview, get our attention, give us a preview. Now go into detail. Tell us, the second part. Tell us. That's you unpacking and fleshing out your main points. That's like a lot of information, and then wrap it all up. Tell us what you told us. Remind us, because when the first time you tell us something, when you give us that little preview, you'll pique my interest, or maybe I was distracted, and like how you pique my interest. Now I'm focused, and now you elaborate on that in the body of the speech, and I'm like, oh wow, that's really interesting. That's I've never heard that before, and then it's almost like I need one more thing to help solidify it, and it's a really good conclusion where you're synthesizing everything and providing closure, and you give that great conclusion where you synthesize everything and you provide closure, and the audience is like, oh, now I get it. Now I'm obviously this is a textbook approach to how this works, but that's kind of like the philosophy, like the logic. Tell us something, and then tell us what you're going to tell us, and then tell us, and then tell us what you told us. For the speaker, it feels redundant, and it is, but it's strategically redundant. You're not just repeating the same thing over and over and over again for no reason, but you're doing it strategically to ensure this whole encouraging retention mindset. That's one way to think about it. All right, and then for the last slide, this is something I recommend that you do on your own time. So I have a speech, I have the link. You can click on the link for this speech. Excellent speech. It's dated, it's pretty old, but it's really, really well done. This would be like a homework assignment that I'm not putting on our course page. It's not going to be worth points. I'm not going to test you on it or anything like that, but you will have at least one or more assignments where you'll watch a speech and provide an analysis and you get graded on it. For this one, I just want you to just practice. If nothing else, at least watch it. At least watch the speech to see an example of a really well done speech. To take it a step further, try to answer these questions at the very least in your mind. Just grapple with grapple with them internally. What are the main points, the supporting points? What's his delivery style like? What does he do that's enhancing his credibility? Can he improve? How so? And you might find some areas for improvement. In this speech, there aren't a whole lot of areas for improvement, but there's no such thing as a perfect speech. And then when you're all done, what do you remember the most? After watching the speech, like what's your biggest takeaway, one or two takeaways from the speech? And then see if maybe the next day, tomorrow, the day after you watch the speech. Do you still remember it? Hopefully some parts of it. So I highly recommend that you do this. If you want to really take it a step further, just type out your answers, right? As you're watching the speech within the notes page, you can have your PowerPoint on one side of your screen and have the YouTube video on the other side of your screen. And then as you're watching the YouTube video, just type in your notes on this PowerPoint slide right here on slide 32. Type in your notes, the main points, the style, all that stuff. It'll make the speech go by more quickly, and it will definitely help you with improving your own public speaking abilities. One of the best ways to improve your public speaking abilities is to watch other speeches and take notes on them. All right, class, hope you're all doing well, and I will talk to you later. Bye.